Theresa Davis was 18 years old the night her mother destroyed the future she had spent years building in secret. She grew up in a narrow brick row house on Mahanango Street in Pottsville, Pennsylvania, a quiet town where traditions mattered more than dreams and where families measured love through obedience instead of words. The house itself felt frozen in time. 2 small bedrooms upstairs, faded wallpaper peeling near the staircase, a kitchen that always smelled faintly of onions and dish soap, and a grandmother who sat silently in the front room every evening watching television with the volume turned completely down. Theresa's father worked long shifts at Lawless Tool and died coming home exhausted with grease under his fingernails, while her mother stayed home taking care of the house and everyone inside. Her younger sister Maddie was 13, loud and curious in the way Theresa used to be before life taught her to stay quiet. In the Davis family, there was one rule that mattered above all others, a rule passed from one generation of women to the next so many times that nobody questioned it anymore. The eldest daughter stayed home. She didn't leave town. She didn't go away to college. She stayed close to her parents, helped raise younger siblings, learned family recipes, married a local man, and eventually repeated the same expectations with her own daughters. Theresa's grandmother had done it. Her mother had done it. Her aunt Carol had done it. Everyone assumed Theresa would too. The rule sat invisibly inside the house like a second set of walls. It lived in the old wooden recipe box on the kitchen counter, the one carved with the word Davis, filled with handwritten recipes passed down through 3 generations. Lasagna, pierogies, applesauce, cake, cabbage rolls. Alongside the recipes came expectations no one ever said directly because they didn't have to. Theresa understood from childhood that her life had already been planned for her long before she was old enough to imagine anything different. But unlike the women before her, Theresa carried a secret dream she never dared speak aloud. She loved numbers, machines, engineering, physics, and the impossible feeling of solving problems nobody else could understand. At school, teachers quietly pushed her toward advanced classes and scholarship programs, but Theresa always pretended it didn't matter. Once she got home, she learned early that ambition made her mother uncomfortable. So instead of arguing, she became careful. She studied in silence. She borrowed SAT prep books from the school library and hid them behind old encyclopedias near the back window on the second floor where no one ever sat. She told her mother she was picking up extra shifts at the Patel family bakery on Saturdays for $10 cash, but many weekends she was actually traveling hours away to testing centers, carrying sharpened pencils and admission tickets in her backpack. While terrified someone from town would recognize her, she took the SAT in October and scored 1560. She took the ACT in November and scored 35. She told absolutely no one, not even Maddie. The scores felt dangerous, like evidence of a crime she hadn't committed yet. Late at night, after everyone went to sleep, Theresa secretly filled out college applications at the library computer, deleting browser history afterward. Like she was hiding an affair. She applied to 7 schools. 6 were practical safety schools. She could never realistically afford the 7th, was the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, a place so far beyond the world she knew that it almost felt fictional. She never truly expected to get in. Part of her only wanted proof that she could have belonged somewhere bigger if life had been different. Deep down, she already believed she would eventually stay in Pottsville like every other eldest daughter before her. Then one Thursday afternoon in March, everything changed. Theresa walked home from school and saw a thick envelope sticking halfway out of the mailbox. Before she even reached the porch steps, the return address carried 3 red letters that instantly stole the air from her lungs. MIT. Thick envelopes meant acceptance. Thin envelopes meant rejection. Every senior in America knew that rule. Her hands shook as she pulled the envelope free and shoved it under her coat before anyone inside the house could see it. She rushed upstairs, locked herself inside the bathroom, and sat trembling on the edge of the bathtub while staring at the unopened envelope in her lap for almost a full minute. She couldn't bring herself to tear it open. When she finally did, the first word she saw was congratulations. The second paragraph explained that MIT was offering her a full need-based scholarship, tuition covered, housing covered, meal plan included. Theresa read the lines over and over again until the words blurred. For the first time in her entire life, someone outside her tiny world had looked at her and seen potential instead of obligation. She cried silently in that bathroom for nearly 15 minutes, terrified someone downstairs would hear, but the joy quickly turned into panic. Her mother opened the mail every afternoon. More documents would arrive soon, financial forms, housing papers. There was no way to hide something this big forever. Theresa folded the letter carefully and hid it beneath the bathroom mat while she tried desperately to figure out what to do next, but she underestimated how quickly secrets collapsed inside small houses. The following evening she walked through the back door after school and froze instantly. Her mother stood at the dining table folding laundry. With terrifying calmness beside the stacks of towels sat Theresa's acceptance letter, opened, read, waiting. Her mother didn't look angry. Somehow that made it worse. Without even glancing up, she quietly said, "Bathroom, trash, isn't private." Theresa tried to explain. She explained the scholarship, the free tuition, the opportunity, the fact that she wouldn't cost the family anything. She had rehearsed the speech dozens of times in her head, but before she could finish, her mother picked up the letter and slowly tore all 3 pages in half. Then she calmly turned the pieces sideways and tore them again. 4 torn pieces drifted onto the table like dead leaves. "This is not who we are," her mother said softly. No yelling, no screaming, just quiet certainty. The silence in the room felt unbearable. Maddie stood frozen halfway down the staircase, gripping the banister with both hands. Theresa's grandmother remained in the front room, staring at the television without reacting. Her father was outside in the garage and never heard any of it happen. 7 seconds, that was all it took for her mother to destroy the future Theresa had spent years building in secret. That night, the women of the family gathered around the kitchen table like judges carrying out a sentence already decided generations ago. Aunt Carol arrived within minutes after her mother called. Her grandmother rolled her chair into the dining room. The torn MIT letter remained in the center of the table the entire evening, beside an untouched applesauce cake. Again and again, Theresa heard the same phrase repeated like scripture: the eldest daughter stays. Nobody asked Theresa what she wanted. Nobody cared about the scholarship or her test scores or the opportunities waiting for her beyond Pennsylvania. Her future had been decided before she was even born. Eventually, Theresa stopped arguing because she realized she wasn't participating in a conversation at all. She was listening to a verdict. Late that night, after everyone finally went to sleep, Theresa quietly crept downstairs and gathered the torn pieces of the letter from the table. She locked herself in the upstairs bathroom, sat on the cold tile floor, and carefully taped the pages back together using Scotch tape from the medicine cabinet. Her mother had taught her how to mend broken hems, repair buttons, and fix damaged things instead of replacing them. She just never imagined Theresa would use those lessons to repair the future her own family tried to destroy. The sentence about the scholarship stretched across 2 crooked tape lines, but it was still readable. Theresa folded the repaired letter carefully and slipped it inside the inner pocket of her denim jacket. Then she opened the bottom dresser drawer where she had hidden everything she might someday need to escape. $340 saved from babysitting a Greyhound bus schedule folded into 8 extra socks, a notebook. She wrote a goodbye letter to Maddie, telling her not to be afraid and promising she would write someday. At nearly 4 in the morning, Theresa slipped the note beneath her sister's pillow and quietly walked downstairs, carrying a duffel bag over one shoulder. But when she passed the garage, she noticed the light was still on. Her father stood alone at his workbench, pretending to fix the carburetor from an old Buick that hadn't run in years. He looked up the moment she appeared in the doorway. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Finally, he wiped his hands on a rag, pulled cash from his wallet, and pressed it into her hand. "Your mother loves you," he said quietly. Theresa nodded through tears. "I know he didn't ask her to stay." That hurt almost as much as if he had. At 5:22 a.m., Theresa boarded a Greyhound bus, leaving Pottsville behind forever. She watched the town disappear through the dirty bus window, while the taped acceptance letter rested safely inside her jacket pocket. She arrived in Boston frightened, alone, and carrying everything she owned in one duffel bag. The first years were brutal. She worked multiple campus jobs, struggled with loneliness, and spent holidays alone in nearly empty dorm buildings because she couldn't afford trips home. Her mother never called, her grandmother never wrote. Aunt Carol told relatives Theresa had become selfish and ungrateful. Only Maddie secretly stayed in contact through letters and later through email. Theresa graduated near the top of her engineering class and eventually built a career designing medical robotic systems that earned patents, awards, and more money than anyone in her family had ever imagined possible. Over the years, she slowly built a life entirely on her own terms. A small apartment became a condo. The condo became a townhouse. Colleagues became friends. Fear slowly became confidence. 7 years passed before Theresa returned home again, and only because Maddie begged her to come to their grandmother's 80th birthday party. The house looked smaller when she walked inside. Older, weaker, somehow 30 relatives crowded the dining room, pretending not to stare at her expensive coat, her confident posture, and the quiet success radiating from her presence. Her mother barely looked at her during dinner. Her grandmother kept repeating that Theresa still looked too thin. Theresa smiled politely through all of it. Then dessert arrived, and Theresa finally stood up, holding a small envelope in her hands. She calmly announced that she had purchased the old Lawless tool and die building after the company shut down months Earlier confused silence filled the room, then Theresa explained she was reopening the factory as a robotics manufacturing facility that would bring more than 200 jobs back to Pottsville within the year. She added that every employee from the original factory, including her father, would be offered work with full benefits if they wanted it. The room fell completely silent. Her father began crying first. Her grandmother stared at Theresa like she was looking at a stranger, but her mother looked physically unable to speak, because in that moment, in front of 30 relatives, the daughter she once tried to trap inside a small town had returned as the most successful person the Davis family had ever produced, and the future her mother tore apart at the kitchen table all those years ago had come back stronger than anyone could have imagined. Theresa stood frozen in the garage doorway while her father slowly reached into his worn leather wallet and counted the money in silence for $20 bills. $80 total. It was Friday night payday, and that was everything he had left on him. His rough hands hesitated for just a second before he held the bills out toward her. Theresa stared at the money, realizing somewhere between dinner and 4 o'clock in the morning her father had made a decision he would probably never speak aloud. He knew she was leaving. He had heard her mother on the phone with Aunt Carol. He had heard the sound of the acceptance letter tearing through the thin walls of the house. He had stayed awake all night pretending to repair the old Buick carburetor, because standing in the garage was easier than standing between his wife and daughter. Theresa quietly took the money and slipped it inside her jacket beside the taped MIT letter resting against her chest. For the bus, her father said softly. He never asked where she was going because he already knew. Neither of them said goodbye. Neither of them hugged. They were a family that survived through silence, and silence was the only language either of them knew. In moments that hurt too much, her father turned back toward the workbench, as if the conversation had ended before it truly began. Theresa picked up her duffel bag and walked out through the side garage door into the freezing Pennsylvania alleyway. It was 411 in the morning. The temperature was barely above freezing, and she could see her breath clouding in front of her face as she walked, the taped acceptance letter pressed against her collarbone beneath her coat, while the $80 sat folded tightly beside it. Together they felt heavier than anything she had ever carried. The Greyhound station in Pottsville was little more than a glass waiting room attached to a Sunoco gas station nearly a mile and a half from her house. Theresa walked the entire distance in 24 minutes with her broken strap navy duffel bouncing painfully against her shoulder. Inside the bag was everything she owned that mattered: 3 changes of clothes, a worn paperback copy of The Catcher in the Rye, her SAT prep book, her folded high school transcript, a spare pair of glasses, her driver's license, and a toothbrush sealed inside a Ziploc bag. That was her entire future packed into one bag, held together by frayed stitching. At the ticket window, a tired man named Earl sold her a one-way Greyhound ticket to Boston for $89. The bus would leave at 5:22 a.m. and arrive at South Station at 6:54 that evening. After more than 13 hours on the road, Theresa carefully counted out the cash with trembling fingers, realizing once the ticket was purchased, she only had $251 left to survive on. Still, for the first time in her life, the fear inside her was mixed with something else: hope. She boarded the bus 8 minutes before departure and chose a seat directly behind the driver. The seat beside her stayed empty. At exactly 5:22 a.m., the bus pulled away from the station, carrying her out of Pottsville and toward a future nobody in her family believed she deserved. As the bus passed through her neighborhood, Theresa stared out the window and saw the faint glow of her kitchen light still burning. For a brief second, she thought she saw her mother's silhouette standing behind the curtains, holding a coffee cup, watching the street in silence. As the Greyhound rolled by, Theresa didn't wave. She doubted her mother even knew she was there. A few minutes later, she noticed the upstairs light in Maddie's bedroom switch on. Her sister had found the goodbye note beneath her pillow. The light stayed on for only a couple minutes before disappearing again, and for years afterward, Theresa would wonder what Maddie did during those 2 minutes. Did she cry? Did she run downstairs? Did she stand at the window searching for the bus already gone? Theresa never knew. Somewhere between Pennsylvania and Connecticut, she pulled the taped acceptance letter from her jacket and reread the scholarship paragraph again. Full tuition, housing included, meals included. She traced the tape lines with her thumb, folded the pages carefully, and slid them back against her chest before falling asleep against a cold bus window. She arrived at South Station in Boston just before 7 that evening. The station smelled like diesel fuel, wet concrete, and pretzel salt. Theresa stepped off the bus, exhausted, hungry, and completely alone in a city larger than anything she had ever imagined. Instead of taking a taxi or subway, she walked the 5 miles to MIT because she couldn't afford transportation. Weeks earlier, she had secretly printed walking directions from the library computer back home and folded them into her pocket. By the time she reached the office of first-generation student programs, it was already 9:30 Friday night, and the building was closed. Theresa sat outside the locked office door, clutching her duffel bag and pretending to study from her SAT prep book, so campus security wouldn't remove her from the hallway. Eventually they did anyway. With nowhere else to go, she spent the weekend sleeping on a vinyl couch in the basement study lounge of the student center, using her duffel bag as a pillow. On Monday morning, a woman named Dr. Marina Ortiz opened the office door and immediately noticed the exhausted teenage girl sitting on the bench outside. "You're early," she joked kindly. Theresa looked up and quietly replied, "I came early." When Dr. Ortiz asked how early, Theresa answered, 3 days. Dr. Ortiz took one look at the dark circles under her eyes, the broken bag strap, and the carefully taped MIT letter. Theresa pulled from her jacket and immediately understood more than Theresa had actually said aloud. She walked Theresa to the cafeteria and bought her eggs, toast, and orange juice with her faculty meal pass. Theresa realized halfway through breakfast that it was the first real meal she had eaten since a cheap hot dog at a bus stop in Hartford. After Theresa explained everything, the missing financial forms, the lack of parental support, the fact she had nowhere to stay, Dr. Ortiz quietly held the repaired acceptance letter in her hands for a long moment. Then she gave it back and said something Theresa would remember forever. "Keep this," she told her gently. "Frame it, cheap frame, expensive frame. Doesn't matter, put it somewhere you can see every day, because one day you'll need to remember exactly what you survived to get here." That became the beginning of Theresa's new life. Her first year at MIT was brutal in ways nobody back home would have understood. She overloaded herself with classes while working more than 30 hours a week between the dining hall and the material science lab. Some nights she slept only 3 or 4 hours before getting up to do it all over again. But she kept going. Her grades climbed higher every semester. A 376 GPA became a 389. Professors began noticing her talent. Research opportunities appeared slowly. Theresa transformed from the frightened girl who arrived carrying a taped acceptance letter into someone who truly belonged there. Twice during freshman year, she emailed her mother. The first message simply contained her dorm address and phone number. The second came after finals and ended with the words, "I miss you." Neither email received a response. Eventually, Theresa stopped trying. Then one night during sophomore year, Theresa checked her email before bed and found a message from an unfamiliar Yahoo address. The subject line simply read, "Mom." The message was from Maddie, only 3 sentences long. "She told the church your dead father Hennessy asked about you after Mass. Aunt Carol confirmed it. Everyone believes it." Theresa stared at the screen for several minutes, unable to process what she was reading. Her own mother had told people in there church that Theresa had died rather than admit her daughter had left home against family tradition. The lie was easier than the truth. A dead daughter brought sympathy. A daughter who escaped brought shame. Theresa closed the laptop and sat alone in the apartment kitchen, drinking water in complete silence, while something inside her permanently shifted. After that night, she stopped imagining there would ever be a real reconciliation waiting for her back home. Years passed. Theresa moved into a tiny studio apartment over a sandwich shop on Massachusetts Avenue. During senior year, the apartment barely held more than a futon, a desk, a kettle, and a cheap bookshelf, but it was hers. Her roommate, Maya, a doctoral student from Lagos, understood loneliness without needing explanations. The two women rarely spoke about their families directly, but both recognized the same look in each other's eyes, the expression of people who had crossed oceans of expectation to become someone entirely different. On Theresa's bedroom wall hung the taped MIT acceptance letter inside a cheap $14 black plastic frame from CVS. The tape lines still showed through the paper. Theresa never replaced it with a cleaner copy. She wanted to remember exactly how close her future had come to being destroyed before it ever began. For nearly 3 years, Theresa carried the taped MIT acceptance letter folded carefully inside the cover of her sophomore year organic chemistry textbook. The paper had softened from being unfolded and refolded so many times. The clear tape lines had started turning brown at the edges, aging slowly the same way scars age on skin. But the tears never reopened the letter. Held together, Theresa often thought about that during difficult nights in the lab when exhaustion blurred her vision and self-doubt crept into her mind. Somehow the letter survived. Just like she had one rainy December evening during her senior year, Theresa finally bought a cheap black plastic frame from the CVS on Massachusetts Avenue, $14, 8 by 10 inches. She brought it back to her tiny apartment and carefully unfolded the letter on the kitchen counter beneath the yellow glow of the overhead light. Using the back of a spoon, she gently flattened the creases as best she could. The tape crackled faintly beneath the pressure. Then she slid the repaired pages behind a glass, sealed the frame shut, and hung it above the small desk where she spent most nights studying. It became the first thing she saw every morning, and the last thing she looked at before sleeping. Late that night, Maya came home from a university lab carrying tea leaves and research notes under one arm. She stopped in front of the framed letter for nearly half a minute without speaking. Finally, she asked quietly, "Why is it taped?" Theresa didn't look up from her laptop. "My mom tried to throw it away." Once Maya nodded slowly, understanding far more from that single sentence than Theresa intended to explain. She never asked again for the next year and a half. Theresa told the same two-word version of the story. Whenever visitors noticed the frame, most people didn't ask. The few who did always became uncomfortable afterward, as though they had accidentally touched something sacred. But Theresa needed the letter on the wall every time she looked up. During long nights of equations research and deadlines, she remembered exactly what it had cost her to sit in that chair. The framed letter became less of a memory and more of a witness, a silent reminder that she had once rebuilt her future on a bathroom floor with shaking hands and borrowed tape. Graduation arrived on a cool Friday morning, and Maykillian Court overflowed with families carrying flowers, cameras, balloons, and signs celebrating their children's accomplishments. Theresa sat among hundreds of graduating mechanical engineering students wearing a black cap and gown while searching the crowd for faces she already knew would probably never appear. Months earlier, she had mailed 4 invitations back to Pottsville, one for her mother, one for her father, one for her grandmother, one for Aunt Carol. Her mother's invitation returned unopened except for one detail Theresa noticed immediately. The envelope had clearly been opened, read, resealed with different tape, and mailed back without a single written word inside. Her father's invitation never came back at all. Maddie later told Theresa he had carried it folded inside his work coveralls for weeks before eventually hiding it in the garage. Her grandmother used Theresa's invitation as a coaster beneath her coffee mug, leaving a perfect water ring stain across the cardboard backing. Maddie secretly photographed it months later and emailed the picture to Theresa without explanation. Aunt Carol simply threw hers away unopened. Still, Theresa reserved for seats in the family section anyway, because some foolish part of her continued, hoping one of them might appear at the last moment. When the ceremony began, 3 of the 4 seats remained empty. Dr. Marina Ortiz sat in the first chair wearing a navy blazer and smiling proudly, like the mother Theresa wished she'd had. Her research advisor, Dr. Sunita Reddy, occupied the second seat, while Maya sat in the third holding flowers wrapped in newspaper. The 4th chair stayed empty the entire day. When Theresa's name echoed across the stage at 11:42 a.m., Dr. Ortiz stood up and clapped loudly enough that several nearby families turned to stare. She was the only person in that entire row who applauded a single graduate by name. Theresa almost cried right there on stage. After graduation, the 4 of them went to a small Indian restaurant on Hampshire Street to celebrate. They talked about doctoral research, future patents, and Theresa beginning her PhD in the fall. Nobody mentioned the empty chair. Nobody mentioned Pottsville. That silence felt kinder than pity ever could. 2 months later, during her first summer as a doctoral student, a mysterious package arrived at Theresa's apartment. It was an ordinary brown cardboard box with no return address, only a shaky handwritten shipping label from Pottsville. Theresa opened it carefully at the kitchen counter using a steak knife. Inside sat her grandmother Margaret's old wooden recipe box, the same oak box that had lived on the kitchen counter for Theresa's entire childhood. The carved word Davis still stretched across the lid, though the varnish looked darker with age. Theresa lifted the lid slowly. Inside were the familiar recipe cards written in her grandmother's looping handwriting: lasagna, pierogies, applesauce, cake, white borscht recipes Theresa could practically recite from memory. Beneath the stack of cards rested a hidden cardboard insert Theresa had never noticed before. Curious, she lifted it out and discovered a yellowed manila envelope hidden underneath. Her stomach tightened immediately. Sitting down on the kitchen floor, Theresa carefully opened the envelope and found 3 items inside. The first was an old high school transcript from Pottsville Area High School dated 1991. The name at the top read Linda Marie Walsh. Her mother Theresa stared in disbelief at the numbers beneath it: GPA 394, National Honor Society senior class. Secretary, top 5% of the graduating class. The second item was an acceptance letter from Lehigh Carbon Community College's nursing program offering Linda a partial scholarship for the fall semester of 1991. Theresa read the lines over and over as understanding slowly settled into her chest like heavy stones. Then she unfolded the third item and finally understood everything. It was Linda's original college acceptance letter, torn in half, carefully taped back together with old yellowed masking Tape that had dried and cracked with age. Theresa could barely breathe as she held it in her hands. 33 years earlier, her mother had once sat exactly where Theresa later sat, repairing her own destroyed future with tape. The same cycle, the same pain, the same eldest daughter rule, the same silence. Theresa suddenly remembered the Scotch tape in the bathroom medicine cabinet the night she repaired her MIT letter. That tape hadn't been random. Her mother had kept tape there because, once upon a time, she had needed it too. Theresa sat on the kitchen floor for nearly 2 hours staring at the papers spread around her. Maya eventually came home and quietly turned off the kettle Theresa had forgotten boiling on the stove. She looked at the documents, looked at Theresa, and understood instantly that something enormous had shifted, but she said nothing. She simply made tea and sat beside her in silence. Theresa slowly pieced together the timeline. Her mother had been 18 in 1991, exactly Theresa's age when MIT accepted her. She had secretly applied to nursing school. Someone, almost certainly Theresa's grandmother, had torn up her acceptance letter. Linda taped it back together and hid it beneath the family recipe cards before ultimately surrendering her future. She stayed. She married Theresa's father. She spent 25 years cooking from the recipes stacked above the dream. She never got to live then when Theresa dared to escape the same fate. Linda repeated the cycle instead of breaking it. Theresa understood her mother for the first time that night, but understanding did not erase the damage. Understanding and forgiveness were not the same thing. One explained the wound, the other demanded healing. Theresa still didn't have. At the very bottom of the envelope rested a faded photograph of her mother at 18, standing outside a college building in borrowed nursing scrubs while holding a community college brochure against her chest. Theresa had seen dozens of photos of her mother growing up, but never one like this. In every family photograph, Linda smiled politely, tightly, carefully. In this photograph, she looked radiant, hopeful, alive. Theresa stared at that smile longer than anything else inside the box because it looked terrifyingly familiar. It looked exactly like her own expression the day she first opened the MIT envelope in the bathroom years earlier. 33 years separated their two taped letters, 2 generations, connected by broken paper and impossible dreams around the same time. Theresa's doctoral research changed her life forever. The biomedical lab where she worked spun off into a startup company called SunScore, focused on creating advanced hospital sensors capable of detecting bloodstream infections in hours instead of days. Theresa helped develop critical parts of the technology and became one of the graduate researchers listed on the patent. In exchange, she received a small founder equity stake in the company. At first, the shares felt meaningless, just technical paperwork buried beneath research deadlines. Then investors arrived, funding rounds closed, the company's value exploded. By the 6th year of Theresa's time at MIT, her vested shares alone were suddenly worth more than $750,000 on paper, with the remaining equity potentially worth millions more in the future. Theresa told nobody back home, not her mother, not her father, not even Maddie. But the night her shares officially vested, she found herself thinking about family for the first time in years. Around midnight, she opened her laptop and sent Maddie a short email with the subject line, "Hi, only one sentence, hope you're okay." Maddie replied almost instantly at 4 in the morning, as though she had been waiting years for Theresa to return. Her response was simple: "Haley just turned 5. She's smart." Theresa level smart. Theresa stared at the email for several minutes, realizing she hadn't even known Maddie had children. She hadn't known their names, birthdays, or faces. She learned all of it in one sentence. 2 days later, Maddie sent a photo of a little girl in pink corduroy overalls building a castle from magnetic blocks on the living room floor. Theresa saved the image into a desktop folder labeled simply M. Over the next 8 months, more pictures appeared: birthday cakes, school drawings, Halloween costumes, family moments Theresa existed outside of, but still quietly treasured. Theresa rarely replied with more than an emoji or a short sentence. She still didn't know how to bridge 7 years of silence, betrayal, grief, and complicated love. But slowly, without either sister fully realizing it, a door that had once been slammed shut began opening a few inches at a time. By the time Theresa's shares in SunScore were worth hundreds of thousands of dollars on paper, she understood something that terrified her more than success ever had. Money could change a life in a single generation, but traditions could survive for centuries if nobody challenged them directly. She had escaped Pottsville, but the system that nearly trapped her was still alive inside the Davis family, waiting quietly for the next eldest daughter. For a while, Theresa believed she still had years before it mattered again. Haley, Maddie's daughter, was only 5 years old. The conversations about staying home, sacrificing dreams, and shrinking herself for family would probably not begin until middle school, or so Theresa thought. Then one October evening, more than 2 years after his last phone call, Theresa's father called again. She was alone in the lab at MIT, running a calibration test on a new detector prototype, when her phone buzzed against the metal workbench. The number carried a Pennsylvania area code. She no longer recognized immediately. Theresa almost ignored it before answering quietly, "Hello." Her father's voice came through the line. Older than she remembered. "Grandma's turning 80 in 6 weeks," he said without greeting. "They want you there." Theresa leaned back against the lab stool, already sensing there was something else hidden beneath the words. Then her father continued carefully, "Your mother's been telling people you never got into MIT, says you flunked out and disappeared." Theresa closed her eyes. Of course, the story had changed again in her mother's version of reality. Theresa could never simply succeed and leave. The narrative had to evolve into something easier for the town to accept. First, she had died. Now she had failed. Both stories protected the family better than the truth ever could. Theresa asked the question she already knew mattered most. "Why are you calling Dad?" Silence stretched across the line for a moment before he answered softly, "Because they're starting on Haley." Theresa sat upright instantly. "What do you mean starting the talks?" he said quietly. "About staying close. Aunt Carol bought her a play kitchen at Easter." Your mother keeps nodding along. Maddie's not pushing back. They're planting the idea now. So Haley grows up thinking it's her own choice. Theresa stared at the calibration numbers blinking on the computer screen without actually seeing them. Haley was 5 years old, 5, and already the family had started shaping her future the same way they shaped every eldest daughter before her. Slowly, quietly, invisibly, Theresa picked up a pen and wrote 2 words across the back of her hand. 6 weeks. Then she asked, "How do you know?" Her father gave a sad little laugh that sounded more tired than amused. "Because I watched it happen to your mother too." After a pause, he added the words Theresa had waited 7 years to hear. "I should have called sooner." Theresa looked down at the ink bleeding slightly against her skin. "Yes," she answered honestly. Then she hung up that night. Theresa never returned to the lab. Instead, she sat alone at her kitchen table until dawn with a yellow legal pad spread in front of her, organizing her thoughts the same way she organized scientific research. Not emotional, not dramatic, controlled, precise. She made categories and numbered lists. What did she want to say? Nothing. Words had never changed anything inside the Davis family. Actions mattered. What did she want to leave behind? The taped MIT letter, the photograph of her mother at 18, proof. Documentation, something Haley could one day hold in her hands. Who was the real audience? Haley, only Haley. Everyone else at the birthday party would simply be witnesses. Theresa understood something important. That night, she wasn't going back to punish her mother. She was going back to interrupt a cycle before it reached another generation. At the bottom of the page, she wrote one final sentence. "This is not revenge. This is a controlled demonstration." Inputs, outputs, variables. Theresa treated the situation like engineering, because engineering made emotional chaos survivable. 2 days later, she met with an attorney named Sarah Klein in an office overlooking Boylston Street in Boston. Sarah specialized in corporate agreements and equity structures, not family trauma. But Theresa didn't need emotional advice. She needed paperwork strong enough to outlive arguments. Theresa explained exactly what she wanted: a legally protected education trust funded with a portion of her SunScore shares, $250,000 placed aside permanently for any descendant of Margaret Davis accepted into a college, university, trade school, or a certification program anywhere in the United States or Canada. Male or female, 2-year or 4-year, it didn't matter. Haley would someday become eligible. So would her younger brother Cody. Sarah looked surprised when Theresa included boys in the trust. "You want this open to everyone?" she asked carefully. Theresa nodded. "The tradition was built around limiting women," she said quietly. "The solution shouldn't repeat that." Sarah spent the next week drafting documents while Theresa finalized the funding transfer from her vested shares. 11 days later, the Davis Daughters Education Trust officially existed on paper. Theresa intentionally kept the word daughters in the title because she wanted the family to understand exactly what history she was rewriting. The trust documents sat inside a cream-colored envelope embossed with Sarah Klein's law firm seal. Sarah asked twice whether Theresa wanted to include a personal note for the family explaining her reasons. Both times Theresa refused. The trust itself was the message. No speech would improve. At the Friday before her grandmother's birthday party, Theresa packed carefully for the first trip back to Pottsville in 7 years. She placed everything inside the brown leather briefcase Maya had given her as a graduation present. At the bottom sat the trust documents. Above them rested proof of her doctoral status at MIT, signed by Dr. Reddy. Then her engineering diploma. Tucked carefully inside the diploma folder was a faded photograph of her mother smiling at 18 outside nursing school, still young enough to believe her life belonged to her. On top of everything rested the taped MIT acceptance letter Theresa removed from its frame that morning. The folds were soft now, the tape lines darker, but the paper still held together. Theresa dressed simply for the drive home. Navy slacks, white button-down shirt, black flats, no jewelry, no makeup, no attempt to impress anyone. She didn't want to look powerful. She wanted to look undeniable. Early Saturday morning, she flew from Boston to Philadelphia, rented a charcoal Honda CR-V, and drove west toward Pottsville through cold November rain. Every mile closer felt strangely unreal, as though she were driving backward into an earlier version of herself. The town looked smaller than she remembered. Saturday to the Patel family bakery, where she once pretended to work, had closed years earlier. Empty storefronts lined Center Street. The Greyhound station still stood beside the gas pumps, exactly where she left it 7 years before. Even the old high school marquee still read "Go Tide" beneath fading red paint. Time had moved everywhere except Pottsville. As Theresa drove through town, memories appeared faster than she could process them. The library window where she secretly studied, the alley behind the garage where she carried her duffel bag into the freezing dark, the church where her mother told people she was dead. Nothing had changed. That was the most painful part. Eventually, she turned onto Mahanengo Street and parked across from the Davis house. The mailbox had been repainted blue. Otherwise, everything looked identical. Theresa sat inside the rental car, gripping the steering wheel while counting slowly to 100 before forcing herself to step outside. The cold November air hit her face as she walked up the porch steps, carrying the leather briefcase in one hand. She knocked twice, using the back of her middle finger, exactly the way her father always knocked when coming in from the garage. A few seconds later, the front door opened partway. Her mother stood there wearing a kitchen apron, same brand as always, different print. Her hair had turned almost half gray since Theresa last saw her. The years showed around her eyes now. For one suspended second, neither woman spoke. Theresa realized with sudden shock that her mother looked smaller, not physically, spiritually, like someone who had spent decades shrinking herself to fit inside a life she never chose. But whatever sympathy Theresa felt vanished the moment her mother finally spoke. "You're early," she said coldly. "The party starts at noon. Stay in the car." Then she closed the door before Theresa could answer. Through the narrow gap before the door shut completely, Theresa caught one brief glimpse of the kitchen behind her mother. The old wooden recipe box sat on the counter exactly where it had always been. Davis carved across the lid. Back home where it belonged. Theresa had secretly mailed the box back the previous summer using Maya's mother's handwriting on the return label, so nobody would know she had ever touched it. Her mother still had no idea Theresa had uncovered the truth hidden beneath those recipe cards. Theresa returned silently to the Honda and sat behind the steering wheel while the heater hummed softly against the windshield. Resting beside her on the passenger seat was the briefcase containing 7 years of silence, proof and history waiting to be opened in front of 30 witnesses. My father finally looked up from the kitchen doorway. The room was so quiet that even the ticking clock above the stove sounded loud. He rubbed one hand across his jaw, the same tired motion I remembered from childhood whenever bills piled up or the Buick refused to start in winter. My mother stood frozen beside the dining table, still holding the photograph of herself at 18 in nursing scrubs, smiling at a future she never got to live. For a second, she looked less like my mother and more like a stranger who had accidentally walked into her own past. My grandmother gripped the handle of her cane hard enough that her knuckles turned white. Aunt Carol looked around the room like she expected somebody else to step in and save the moment for her. Nobody did. "Frank, where did she get this?" my mother asked again, quieter this time. My father exhaled slowly from the recipe box. "Linda." The answer landed in the room with more force than shouting ever could. My mother's shoulders dropped a fraction. Aunt Carol sat back down heavily in her chair. My grandmother's mouth tightened into a line so thin it almost disappeared. Maddie was still kneeling beside Haley, one arm around her daughter, while the taped MIT letter rested across her lap. Haley traced the brown tape lines with one small finger, like she was studying a map. "You went through my things," my mother whispered. "No," I said calmly. "I opened something you hid, because I finally understood why you tore mine." My grandmother struck the floor once with her cane. "That letter should have stayed buried. Some things are done for the good of the family." I looked at her then fully. For the first time since I walked into the house 7 years earlier, I had still been afraid of her certainty, afraid of the way she could turn tradition into law with one sentence. But now she looked old, not weak, just old, old enough that the rules she carried no longer looked permanent. "For whose family?" I asked. Nobody answered. Mrs. Vargas quietly set her coffee cup down on the side table. Mrs. Hardesty stared into her lap. Tim shifted uncomfortably near the television. The entire room had become a witness to something everyone had pretended not to see for decades. My mother folded the photograph once in her hands like she might put it away again, hide it again, return it to silence for another 30 years. Instead, she lowered herself into the dining chair beside the cake. Her eyes stayed on the picture. When she finally spoke, her voice sounded tired. "I got the letter on a Tuesday," she said softly. "Your grandmother opened it before I came home from school. No one moved." I Had never heard my mother tell a story about herself before. Not really. Mothers in our family did not have histories. They only had responsibilities. She told me nurses work nights and weekends and forgot their families. She said girls who left home came back selfish. I told her it was only community college. I remember saying only because I thought smaller dreams would scare her less. My grandmother snapped. It wasn't about fear then. What was it about? Maddie asked suddenly. Every head in the room turned toward her. Maddie stood slowly, Haley still tucked against her side. She wasn't loud. She didn't need to be. Her voice carried anyway, because I'm listening to this, and all I can think is Haley's 5 years old, and you've already started talking about her like her life belongs to this house. My grandmother opened her mouth, but Maddie kept going. No, you got your turn, Mom got your turn, Theresa got your turn, Haley is not getting your turn too. The silence afterward felt enormous. My mother closed her eyes. Briefly, when she opened them again, they were wet. It was the first time in my life I had ever seen my mother cry without trying to hide it. I thought if you stayed, she said to me quietly, maybe I wouldn't feel like I lost everything for nothing. The sentence hit harder than the torn letter ever. Had I understood then that my mother had spent 25 years trying to survive her own decision by turning it into destiny. If I left and succeeded, then it meant the sacrifice had never been necessary. It meant the pain had not been noble. It had simply been pain. I walked to the dining table slowly and sat across from her. Between us rested the photograph, the trust documents, and 70 years of women teaching daughters how to disappear politely. You didn't lose everything. I said you lost yourself. My mother looked down at the photograph again. The girl in the nursing scrub smiled up at her from 33 years ago, hopeful, certain, alive in a way I had never known her to be. Grandma said families survive because somebody stays, she whispered, and sometimes families survive because somebody leaves. No one spoke after that. Haley climbed into a chair beside Maddie and carefully unfolded the MIT letter. Again, the tape crackled softly. She looked at the red logo across the top and asked the question nobody in that room expected. Aunt Theresa, what's MIT? A few people laughed nervously, but I smiled. It's a school. Are you smart? Maddie let out one short laugh through her tears. My father covered his mouth with one hand like he was hiding a smile. I studied hard, I answered. Haley looked down at the letter again. Can I go to school there? My grandmother started to speak. Automatically, before she could answer, my mother interrupted her. Yes, every head turned. My mother's voice shook, but she said it again. Anyway, yes, you can. The room went completely still. My grandmother looked betrayed. Aunt Carol looked frightened. My father looked relieved in a way that made him seem suddenly 10 years younger. My mother reached toward the taped letter in Haley's hands, but stopped before touching it. I should have let you keep yours, she said to me. I nodded. Once the apology did not fix anything. Some things do not get fixed, but it mattered that she finally said it out loud in front of everyone who had helped keep the lie alive. Mrs. Hardesty quietly cleared her throat while she said awkwardly, I think it's wonderful. Mrs. Vargas nodded quickly. So do I. The room slowly began breathing again. Conversations restarted in scattered pieces. Somebody cut the cake. Cody began crying because he wanted frosting first. Tim carried him toward the kitchen. Donnie asked my father about the eagle's life. Stubbornly kept moving, but the center had shifted. My grandmother sat in her green armchair with both hands folded over her cane, watching the room like it no longer belonged entirely to her. For the first time in 80 years, the rule had failed publicly, and everyone had survived it. I stayed for 40 more minutes. I ate one slice of lemon cake at the kitchen counter, while Haley asked me if robots were hard to build. I showed Cody how the brass buckle on my briefcase worked. Aunt Carol avoided my eyes the rest of the afternoon. Mrs. Vargas hugged me on her way out and whispered, good for you, honey. At 1:26 p.m., my father followed me onto the porch while guests were still putting on coats inside. The November air smelled like chimney smoke and cold pavement. You heading back tonight? He asked. Yeah, he nodded. He shoved his hands into his jacket pockets the same way he had the morning I left 7 years earlier. I should have stopped it back then, he said quietly. Maybe. He looked down at the porch steps. I didn't know how I believed him. That was the hardest part. After a moment, he pulled something from his pocket and handed it to me, folded carefully into a square. I opened it. It was my graduation invitation, the one he never answered. The edges were worn soft from being carried. I had it with me that day. He admitted. Sat outside the auditorium in the truck for an hour. Couldn't make myself walk, and I stared at him. Why not? He swallowed. Once, because if I saw you up there, then no leaving was the right thing. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, I folded the invitation again and handed it back to him. Keep it, I said. He nodded. Then, unexpectedly, he hugged me, first tighter this time. When I pulled away, my mother was standing behind the screen door watching us. She didn't come outside. She didn't ask me to stay, but she didn't look away either. I walked down the 4 porch steps carrying the empty briefcase. The trust documents were inside the house now. So was the photograph. So was the Taped letter. I drove out of Pottsville at 2:03 p.m. The same streets, the same brick buildings, the same church steeple over Howard Avenue, but the town looked different leaving at 31 than it had leaving at 18. At 18, I thought survival meant escape. At 31, I understood survival also meant returning long enough to leave the door unlocked behind you. 6 years later, Haley sent me her first college application essay. The opening sentence read, "The women in my family used to believe staying was the same thing as love." My mother turned back toward me so fast the chair legs scraped hard against the kitchen floor. Her face had gone pale beneath the anger, the kind of pale that comes when somebody realizes a secret survived longer than they thought it could. The photograph still trembled slightly in her hands. "You went through my things," she said, again louder. "Now you stole from me. You stole my life." The room stiffened around her words. My grandmother sat frozen in the green armchair, one hand pressed flat against the top of her cane. Aunt Carol crossed herself automatically, like she did during storms and funerals. Maddie remained kneeling beside Haley on the carpet, the taped MIT letter pressed tightly against her chest now, like she already understood it was more than paper. I did not raise my voice. Maddie found the recipe box in the attic. Maddie mailed it to me. I only opened what someone else tried to bury. My mother's eyes shot toward Maddie. Maddie looked back calmly. For the first time in her life, not apologizing, not shrinking, not asking permission, something in my mother's expression cracked right then, because she realized the silence she had inherited was no longer automatic in her daughters. "You don't get to come back here after 7 years and act like you understand this family," my mother snapped. I picked up the briefcase slowly from beside the chair. It felt lighter. Now the important things were no longer inside it. The trust papers sat on the coffee table. Beside the birthday cake, the photograph rested face up on the dining table for everyone to see. The taped MIT letter was in Haley's hands. My diploma and PhD paperwork were still in the case, untouched. Almost irrelevant degrees had never been the point. Permission had been the point. I walked toward the front door. Every eye in the room followed me. My hand settled on the brass knob. Before I opened it, I turned back toward my mother. "One last time I taped mine too, Mom," I said quietly. "Same brand of tape." For a second, nobody moved. Then I opened the door and stepped outside into the cold November air. Behind me, through the wood of the closed door, I heard my mother's voice rise into something raw and breaking, a sound I had never heard from her before in my entire life. Not anger, exactly grief, maybe, or regret arriving too late to be useful. I walked across the street toward the rental Honda CR-V parked under the yellowing maple tree. Leaves scraped across the sidewalk. In the wind, my breath fogged. White in front of me, I slid into the driver's seat and shut the door. The inside of the car was freezing now. I checked the dashboard clock, 1:07 p.m. I placed both hands on the steering wheel, but did not start the engine for the first time in 7 years. I shook, not from fear, not from guilt, from release, like my body had finally realized the fight was over. A knock sounded lightly against the driver's side window. Maddie, she stood there in her winter coat, with Haley's pink mitten dangling from one pocket in her arms. She carried the cream-colored trust envelope, and the taped MIT letter. Snow had started drifting lightly through the air behind her, tiny flakes dissolving against the windshield. I rolled the window down halfway. "Haley wants to keep this," Maddie said softly, lifting the letter a little. She can. Maddie looked down at the envelope. "Next is the trust, real, notarized, filed last month. Sarah Klein in Boston handles it." She nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of it. Her eyes looked tired in the way young mothers' eyes do when they spend years taking care of everyone before themselves. "Tim's going to ask questions," she admitted. "Tim doesn't have to sign anything. You're the custodial parent. Haley and Cody are beneficiaries either way." "What about Cody?" "Page 3, same terms." Maddie exhaled visibly into the cold air. Then she laughed once under her breath, not because anything was funny, but because something impossible had suddenly become real. "You really did it," she whispered. I looked back toward the house. Through the curtains, I could see shadows moving in the dining room. My grandmother's silhouette near the armchair, Aunt Carol pacing, my father standing motionless in the kitchen doorway. "Yeah," I said quietly. "I guess I did." Maddie tightened her grip on the letter and the envelope. "Are you coming back again?" I looked at the old brick house across the street, at the upstairs window that used to be mine, at the porch where my father once handed me his last $80 in silence. "I don't know yet." Maddie nodded once that was enough. She turned and walked back across the street, carrying both futures carefully against her chest. I watched her disappear through the front door before finally starting the engine. 3 months later, my father called again. It was a Wednesday evening in February. Snowstorm warnings crawled across the bottom of the television in my Cambridge apartment while onions sizzled in olive oil on the stove. My phone buzzed against the counter. Pennsylvania area code. I almost let it ring out from habit. Instead, I answered Theresa. Dad, his voice sounded different now, lighter, somehow less cautious. "Haley started a Saturday science program today." I stopped stirring the onions. "What kind of program?" "STEM camp at Lehigh Carbon Community College, elementary students, 6 Saturdays." The knife rested motionless in my hand. Lehigh Carbon, the same school that had mailed my mother her nursing acceptance letter 33 years earlier, the same school she never got to attend. Dad continued quietly. "Maddie used Money from the trust to sign her up. Tim said it was a waste for a 5-year-old. Maddie told him it wasn't his decision. I smiled before I realized I was smiling. How did Haley, like if they built baking soda rockets? He said. She came home talking about Mars for 2 straight hours. I laughed softly, then the first real laugh I'd had all week. My father grew quiet on the other end of the line. Your mother knows where the money came from, he said finally. Okay, she hasn't said anything about it. Another pause. But she cut Haley's science camp schedule out of the refrigerator and taped it inside the recipe box. I closed my eyes for a moment. I pictured the old wooden box sitting on the kitchen counter beneath the yellow light recipe cards on top, a child science schedule hidden underneath beside a broken scholarship letter from 1990. The tape, continuing forward instead of backward. Thank you for telling me, Dad. He cleared his throat. Softly, I should have called sooner about a lot of things. Yeah, I said gently. Probably, he accepted that without defending himself. A few weeks later, a pink envelope arrived at my apartment addressed in large, uneven handwriting. The return address was written in backwards kindergarten letters. Haley. Inside was a folded crayon drawing of a giant red brick building with 6 windows and a crooked blue roof. Across the top, in giant pink letters, Haley School. The drawing included a tiny stick figure with yellow hair, standing beside the building wearing what looked like a lab coat. Folded carefully behind the drawing was the original taped MIT letter. The tape had darkened more around the edges. Now time was slowly turning it amber. On the back of the last page, attached with a crooked yellow post-it note, was one sentence written in Maddie's handwriting, but clearly dictated by Haley. I'm done with this one, I'll write my own. I sat at my kitchen table for a very long time staring at that sentence. Then I reframed the letter, same cheap black frame, same nail above my desk, but this time the tape scholarship letter no longer looked broken to me. It looked inherited. Years later, when Haley was 16, she asked me something while we were touring colleges together in Boston. We were standing outside a glass engineering building while students crossed campus carrying backpacks and coffee cups through the autumn wind. Haley looked up at me and asked quietly, were you scared when you left? Yes, I answered honestly. Then why did you do it? Because sometimes the first person who leaves isn't leaving for herself alone. Haley thought about that for a moment, then she slipped her hand into mine as we crossed the street toward the admissions office back in Pottsville. My grandmother died 2 winters later. At the funeral luncheon, the recipe box sat on the kitchen counter one final time, only now there was something new inside it. Beneath the recipe cards, beneath my mother's taped nursing letter, beneath Haley's science schedule, there was a college brochure from Carnegie Mellon with Haley's name written across the front in purple marker. My mother placed it there herself. She never apologized again after the birthday party. Not directly. Some women from her generation do not know how to turn regret into language. But when Haley left for college at 18, my mother drove her to campus herself. And before Haley got out of the car, my mother handed her a brand new roll of Scotch tape and said, just in case you ever need to fix something nobody else understands yet.